But today I'm actually making a video, so that's fun. It's the kind of thing where I've got an awful lot to say, and that I am also very nervous about who's going to hear. Does that make sense? Like, I want my ideas to be preserved, like I want my ideas to be, like I'm tired of thinking and I want my ideas put somewhere. And I think they're good ideas. It's really frustrating though. I mean, I've had a couple of conversations recently which, while not the reason why I want to make this video, they are contributing factors, and it's not like I need to reply to a specific person, but rather I'm noticing a pattern and I want to address that more holistically. It's about queer history, and there are several different things that I feel like I need to talk about. And part of it is the fact that people are of two very different camps on me and what I have to say about queer history. You know, you and a lot of people are like, wow, Chloe's really outspoken and she has a lot to say. Other people are like, wow, Chloe is really conservative and almost offensive in how much she, intellectually bends to, straight readings of queer history. Which, those are two very different ideas. There are a lot, hey, everyone's a critic. It's fine. Clearly. Well, I think that my ideas are specific. And that's why people have such a hard time putting me into one camp or the other. Because when it comes to, for example, when it comes to picking a queer theory to use while I'm researching my histories, my ideas are very post-structural, and they're very flexible. And they're very temporally specific and geographically specific and socioeconomically specific. And so I don't have just one working theory. And I think that a lot of people want to have an answer, and I'm willing to listen to everybody. If somebody, defines their bisexual past as when they were married to a man and only dating women, okay, and you're not bi now? They're like, oh no, I haven't been bi in years. Okay, people of my generation would probably define bisexual very differently, but I'm not going to tell this 55-year-old woman that her experiences and our identities aren't valid. You know what I mean? Yeah, so it's things like that where I'm, my ideas are, flexible enough within a larger paradigm, but it works for me. It works for me and my studies, and I find it more interesting because it takes more perspectives into account. So that's one thing that is that I'm critiqued kind of on both sides when I try to do work. It's on one hand it's oh my god, Chloe, she never shuts up about lesbians, and then on the other hand it's oh my god, is she still trying to do lesbians? Won't she give up and just go back to labor history or whatever? And yeah, I can do that too. Calm down. I know, and clearly, going right down the middle isn't working out for me either. So, I'm kind of working on being specific. But then, there's a secondary thing where it's when you look at media and when you look at historic figures, everybody is like, oh, they couldn't possibly be gay. It's not obvious. You can't just read gay into everything. Well, I mean, consider this. Living people get accused of being gay all the time with way less evidence than Nick Carraway leaving Buchanan's party with a guy, and then the next thing you see in the book is that they're in their underwear in bed looking at photography. I don't think Nick Carraway is straight, but then you can kind of gloss over that while you're oh, this person is gay and they need to lose their job. You know what I mean? Where if they're alive today, you want to accuse, but if it's in literature or if they're in the past, you can't throw that in jail. So you better just look the other way and gloss right over it. It's two very different standards. Right. And there's again there's kind of two sides of this there too. There's a nuance because sometimes it's allowed, like in a lot of Native American communities, Two Spirit is it's just a gender identity, and in India there's a third gender, and that's something that existed. Um, a lot of ancient Greek writers were gay, and that's just how they were. You know, Spartan men were like they had to like sneak into their wives' houses to like do the do, and it was like shameful. Like on her wedding day, the woman would be like her hair would be cut to look like a guy's haircut, and they dress her in like men's clothes. It was like weird. Like it was like they didn't want to be straight. They like they made straight as gay as possible because of shame, and it was built into every piece of their like system. Is that um, it's just fascinating anyway. But then on the flip side is that there's been so much destruction of gay history. You know, and sometimes you think it's like irrefutable, but then on the other hand, you know, um, how many queer people never had children, you know, for one reason or another, either because they wanted children and couldn't adopt, or because they had their children taken away, or because they were never in a straight marriage and never had children. So there are so many different ways that this would happen. But you know, if you have like, oh, like my weird bachelor uncle, let's just like make sure we burn all his correspondence so nobody ever like sees anything they shouldn't, and preserve his, you know, reputation. Well, that's great, you know, for the family, but that's not so great for queer history because so much is erased that way. You know, so we have basically court documents, literature, and like not a whole lot of, you know, family history. So it's complicated. So yeah, so I mean there's just so many different ways to look at queer history. Um, you know, and that doesn't even account for the amount of patience you have to have as a reader to really understand all of the regional variations and why different communities formed in different ways over time. Because you know, former soldiers in the 1920s looks very, very different from butch femme relationships in inner cities in the 1950s. Like these are like it's both queer, but they look so different, and you need a lot of patience if you're going to understand the history, not just because it's specific and you know, very carefully crafted and regionally specific, but also because it's so different from, you know, like our day-to-day operations. It's these relationships, they don't look like your typical straight relationships, and of course straight relationships have changed over time too, but yeah, no, queer relationships just they're just so different. And so if you want to talk about one thing and then, you know, jump, if you want, okay, like if you're talking about, you know, Miami, Latin queer culture is very different from in like Memphis is completely different. You know, the segregation will look different. It's just completely different. And then there's a question of like who's telling the story, because you know, Great Gatsby reads very, very different than Portrait of Dorian Gray, you know, because, you know, on one hand, you've got like a gay author who's just like, I'm gonna write a story about the most beautiful man ever who gets to be young and hot forever, and it's awesome. And I'm gonna write a painter character who's really into him, and all the beauty pours into this canvas, and it's magical now. It's so beautiful, it's magic. Like, that's very, very, very different from Nick Carraway, who's like constantly telling his audience how like honest he is, and how he's like, oh, I'm really honestly, I'm like I'm telling you the truth here, and he's like paranoid about, you know, people thinking he's deceiving them. It's like every few pages the novel comes to a screeching halt because, you know, because Fitzgerald has all of these hang-ups about homosexuality that you see in not just this novel, but in his other novels as well. And he ties homosexuality to morality. And these books were written, what, 30 years apart? But they show just very different ideas. And of course, a lot of things happened in those 30 years, but the authors all had very different ideas um, about their characters. And of course, those are both novels, but, you know, histories, it's the same thing. You know, there's just going to be different perspectives, and who gets to tell that story. And what even is a cultural successor at this point? Because queer cultures today look so different than they used to. So do queer people today have any claim over, you know, queer cultures 100 years ago? I don't know. I think they're most definitely more affected by it, but they aren't necessarily related to them. They aren't necessarily in the same geographical location. If anything ties them together, it's probably the laws. And yet the laws were written by the same society that, you know, made them live in fear and oppressed them. Which, you know, in that sense, there's a commonality. But there's just so much going on. I think it's hard to say. Because, you know, when you repatriate an item to its culture of origin, the idea is that it belongs there. It belongs to these people. It's going back to a people who can interpret it better, and, you know, means something more to them. That doesn't really exist with queer people. You know, it's not just from one family or one group or even one geographical location. It's such an intellectual exercise to come up with and understand these communities and identities. And it's so ephemeral that it's hard to talk about. And it can be really frustrating to talk about. And sometimes I think, like, well, if it's this frustrating to talk about, is it even worth talking about it? And I think it is. That's my point, is that, you know, with, like, straight, you know, the families tend to be straight, and then with gay, it's like the families still tend to be straight. I am saying that the family story and the family lineage and the family culture overall is a straight culture, and you might have, like, oh, like your weird cousin who is like the gay one, but the family itself is still structurally and culturally straight. So queer people tend to be raised in straight families. But you're right, like, straightness looks very different now as compared to in other times. Yeah, one of my favorite things to tell people when, you know, I used to work at the plantation was that they would say, like, well, why is this slave a Benahan? And I said, well, it's because, you know, he's owned by the Benahans. You know, why do women change their name? And that, like, then people would get a little offended, but then they'd kind of realize, like, oh, hot damn, she's onto something. Well, thanks for letting me bounce some ideas off of you. I mean, like I said, like, everything is two things at once, and that's what makes it hard to think about. It's hard to talk about. It's just difficult. And until next time, make history.